Welcome aboard the dark waters of the Night Crew podcast, where true crime meets the unknown. Each month we dive into the eerie, the unsolved, and the stories that haunt the shadows. If it's creepy, mysterious, or just plain unsettling, you'll find it here. So light your lantern, step onto the deck, and prepare to uncover what lies beneath the surface.
This podcast contains discussions of true crime, disturbing content, and mature themes that may not be suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion is strongly advised. The Night Crew podcast aims to present stories with respect to the victims and their families, and the intent is never to sensationalize tragedy, but to shed light on the unknown and unexplained. Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 16 of The Night Crew. Today, we will be talking about Project Miranda, the Bunker of Horrors. Now, this one I had never heard of before, but I used AI to figure out what stories to do because I want to talk about the stories that no one's ever heard of before, and this one was shocking to say the least. So, without further ado, we'll just jump right into it. Some of the most terrifying monsters in true crime history don't lurk in the shadows alone. They find each other, like two halves of a nightmare, and together, they become something far more dangerous than either could be on their own. Today, we're diving into one of the most disturbing cases of serial murder and sadism America has ever seen. The story of Leonard Lake and Charles Ng. Now, I'm just going to be calling Charles either Charles or Ng. He has a Chinese name, so it's kind of hard to pronounce the whole thing. So these two men were driven by delusion, domination, and a shared fantasy of control. Their crimes would leave behind a trail of missing people, haunting videotapes, and even a remote bunker that became a chamber of horrors. But before that torture, before all the murders, before the world even knew their names, the seeds of this darkness were planted decades earlier. So I'm going to be talking about Leonard Lake's early life, and then I'll do Charles next, about their childhood. Leonard Thomas Lake was born in San Francisco in 1945, and from the very start, his life was shaped by abandonment and dysfunction. When he was just 6 years old, his parents divorced, and Leonard and his siblings were sent to live with their grandmother. It's in those early years that the first signs of something deeply disturbing began to emerge. Leonard was described as highly intelligent but unnervingly detached, a boy who didn't just harm animals for fun, but conducted what he called experiments. He once dissolved mice in chemicals just to watch how their bodies broke down. He also coerced his sisters into posing nude for photos, a chilling preview of the control and sexual violence that would later define his life. By his teenage years, Leonard was obsessed with end-of-the-world scenarios. He devoured survivalist magazines and wrote fantasies about rebuilding civilization after a nuclear apocalypse. Fantasies where he was always in control and women were nothing more than property to be used for repopulation, in his eyes. When he enlisted in the Marines during the Vietnam War, those fantasies did not fade. They deepened. But Leonard's time in the military ended abruptly when he was diagnosed with a personality disorder and discharged. A man who came home from the war was a loner, a doomsday prepper, and someone who believed he was destined to rule over others. Now we go into Charles Ng. So Charles' story begins thousands of miles away in Hong Kong. Born in 1960 into a wealthy and respected family, Charles seemed destined for success. But behind the image of privilege was a childhood defined by fear. His father was a powerful businessman, strict, authoritarian, and physically abusive. Charles grew up terrified of failure, and by his teenage years, that fear had turned into rebellion. He was expelled from multiple schools for theft and violence and was arrested for shoplifting by the age of 15. So he started young. In 1978, his family sent him to the United States on a student visa, hoping a fresh start would straighten him out. It didn't. Charles dropped out almost immediately and joined the U.S. Marines, where his pattern of theft continued. He was caught stealing weapons and went AWOL, fleeing authorities and disappearing into the California survivalist scene. A perfect storm. This is when Leonard Lake and Charles meet. It was in that world, the paranoid, end-of-days fringe of 1980s California, that Charles and Leonard Lake's paths collided. Lake, by now in his late 30s, was living off the grid and obsessed with a project he called Miranda. It was his twisted vision of a post-apocalyptic society where he would rule over enslaved women who would bear his children. He placed an ad in a survivalist magazine looking for like-minded people. And guess who answered? Charles. The two met in person soon after, and their connection was almost instant and unsettling. Lake, older and manipulative, saw in Charles someone eager to follow orders and willing to do anything for him. Charles, directionless and angry, saw in Lake a mentor, even a father figure, who validated his darkest impulses. Before long, Charles moved into Lake's compound. Together, they began stockpiling weapons, digging bunkers, and fantasizing about their future. But those fantasies wouldn't stay fantasies for long. So what began as a disturbing bond between two broken men would soon evolve into one of the most horrifying murder sprees in modern American history. And deep in the woods of Wilseyville, California, they would build their private hell, a bunker destined for torture, control, and death. So, when Leonard Lake and Charles began putting Project Miranda into action, their crimes weren't random. They were meticulously planned, rehearsed, and just really planned out to the T. Their victims weren't just people who crossed their path by chance. They were carefully selected, stalked, and trapped, all to fulfill Lake's sick vision of control and domination. The first known victims, Michael Carroll and Brenda O'Connor. The first known victims were not random strangers. They were acquaintances, people who had some connection to Lake. Michael Carroll, a friend of Leonard Lake, came to the cabin under the pretense of helping with household tasks. What followed was the first clear pattern of what would become Project Miranda: psychological manipulation, confinement, and ultimately murder. Michael's body was later found dismembered and partially burned. Around the same time, Brenda O'Connor, a young woman who had become involved through an acquaintance of Lake's, was abducted. She and her partner were held captive in the bunker. Her partner, Lonnie Bond, and their infant child were murdered quickly, leaving Brenda alive to endure days of confinement. On tape, Brenda can be heard pleading, terrified, trying to reason with Lake. She said, "Please, just let me go. I'll do whatever you want." Lake's response, calm and chilling, reflects the core of his psychology. He said, "You're here now for a purpose. There is no escape." From the very beginning, Lake and Charles' cruelty combined psychological terror with physical domination, establishing the patterns that would define all of their later crimes. Pattern of victimization. Their crimes followed a disturbing routine. Typically, there's a few different ways. There's luring victims, either through acquaintance, business opportunities, or random encounters with hitchhikers. Then there's initial confinement. Victims were chained or shackled in the soundproof bunker, often stripped and isolated. Psychological manipulation. Lake lectured women about their role, their supposed duty to him, and the inevitability of their fate. Charles often enforced obedience, mocking and intimidating the victims. Execution. Men and children were killed quickly to eliminate witnesses. Women, they were often tortured and kept alive to satisfy Lake's twisted vision of Project Miranda. And another common theme was erasing evidence. Bodies were dismembered, burned, or buried in shallow pits. Personal items, IDs, and clothing were sometimes retained as trophies. And then I'll go into the more notable victims and stories. There is Kathleen Allen. She was 18 years old, and she was abducted while leaving her workplace. She was brought to the bunker, chained to the wall, and subjected to relentless psychological terror. Lake forced her to obey his orders, to speak on camera, and to participate in his ritualized, controlled exercises. Her boyfriend, who came searching for her, was also captured and killed, demonstrating the lethal efficiency with which Lake and Charles eliminated any witnesses. They didn't want anyone knowing what they were doing. The Dubs family. One of the most heartbreaking cases involved Harvey and Deborah Dubs and their 1-year-old son, Sean. The family was lured under false pretenses to the cabin. Harvey was executed first. Deborah was kept alive, forced to watch, threatened, and psychologically terrorized. Their child, Sean, was also killed. Evidence suggests Lake viewed it as removing potential witnesses and further asserting control. Investigators found only fragments and ashes after the property was searched, which is like, a 1-year-old is not going to remember any of that stuff. They really just want to kill men, and then they kept women alive for repopulation. Is truly all it was. And the other notable victims and stories would be couples and random hitchhikers. So as the years went on, Lake and Charles expanded their targets. Couples seeking jobs or hitchhiking alone became prey. Each followed the same horrific routine: capture, confinement, psychological abuse, and eventual execution. Videotapes and journals reveal the cold, deliberate cruelty, victims pleading, begging, or resisting, only to be further humiliated and terrorized. Psychological terror and control. What made Lake and Charles so terrifying wasn't just the physical abuse. It was the psychological manipulation. Women were made to call Lake master, instructed to obey every demand, and threatened with the deaths of loved ones. Charles played the enforcer, often laughing, mocking, or delivering threats themselves. Investigators later described the tape as the most sadistic, calculated abuse we've ever seen. This was not random violence. It was systematic erasure of humanity. The bunker itself became a tool of terror. Victims lived in constant fear, unaware of what was happening to others, or if they themselves would live to see another day. Now, I have not listened to these tapes, but I'm sure they're on Reddit or YouTube, somewhere like that. It's hard to listen to those tapes because they're deeply disturbing. So do with that knowledge what you will. The scale of horror. When police finally investigated the property, the extent of the crimes was staggering. Dozens of burned or dismembered bodies. There was fragments of bone and teeth that couldn't be fully identified. There were journals and ledgers with detailed notes on victims, some never reported missing. And then there was videotape showing repeated cycles of torture and abuse, revealing both men's roles. Lake as the mastermind, Charles as the enforcer. Confirmed victims number at least 11 people, but estimates suggest 25 or more, with some remains unidentifiable. Many victims may be never known, due to them burning everything, destroying all pieces of evidence and witnesses. From the very first victims to the escalation of cruelty over the years, Lake and Charles perfected a system of terror that was both just planned and deeply personal. Every victim, every act was part of a larger vision. Lake's apocalyptic Project Miranda. Next, we'll follow the unraveling of this nightmare, the investigation, the evidence that led to their capture, and the trial that finally brought some measure of justice. But even today, the true scope of their crimes remains a chilling mystery. The nightmare of Lake Charles didn't end with their victims. In fact, their undoing began almost by accident, a small mistake that would unravel years of meticulous terror. By 1985, Lake had become increasingly careless, which I feel like that happens to a lot of serial killers. They just don't care after a certain amount of time because they get away with it forever. Anyways, one of his early captures, a young woman who managed to escape briefly, tipped authorities to his location. Soon, police had reason to investigate the remote property where they stayed in. And there's the discovery of the bunker. When authorities arrived at Lake's cabin, what they found was shocking even to seasoned investigators. The cabin seemed innocent at first glance, tucked into the Sierra Nevada woods. But below, the bunker revealed the horrifying reality of Project Miranda. Shackles and chains still bolted to the walls. There was tape restraints, mattresses, and soundproof rooms used to confine victims. There were burn pits and charred bone fragments, evidence of attempts to erase human life. And obviously there were videotapes and journals everywhere. So Lake's meticulous record keeping was both chilling and damning. Investigators described the bunker as a house of horrors, a place where the combination of psychological manipulation and physical violence was perfected to a T. The arrest of Leonard Lake. On June 1985, police finally cornered Leonard Lake, but the moment he realized capture was imminent, Lake made a shocking decision. He committed suicide by cyanide poisoning, leaving Charles still at large. Lake's death meant he would never face a courtroom for the monstrous crimes he had planned and executed. Essentially, he took the easy way out. However, the discovery of the bunker, the tapes, and the journals provided investigators with an unprecedented window into the scope of Project Miranda. Every chilling detail, every recorded scream and plea for mercy was evidence that would eventually bring justice. And then we go into Charles' escape and manhunt. He really ran for it. He did not want to get caught. Charles was nowhere to be found. After Lake's death, Charles disappeared, sparking one of the most extensive manhunts in California history. Investigators trace him across the country, piecing together his movements from credit card records, eyewitness accounts, and occasional sightings. Charles had fled to Canada, where he lived under an alias and continued committing crimes. It took several years in the cooperation of international authorities to finally bring him back to California to face justice. During the manhunt, media coverage of the Lake and Charles case intensified, sensationalizing the horror of the crimes while also warning the public about the unpredictable and sadistic nature of the pair. The trial of Charles. When Charles was finally extradited to the United States in 1991, that took a long time, The courtroom became a stage for one of the most shocking trials of the 20th century. The prosecution presented the videotapes from the bunker showing victims' captivity and abuse. They showed the journals and ledgers with detailed accounts of each murder. And obviously they showed the physical evidence, charred bones, personal effects, and remnants of the shackled rooms. Charles' defense tried to claim lack of direct involvement in some murders, but the overwhelming evidence, combined with his presence and assistance in every step of Project Miranda, left little room for doubt. The trial lasted several months, but the outcome was decisive. Charles was convicted of multiple counts of murder and sentenced to death in California, a sentence that reflected the scale and cruelty of his crimes. Media coverage and public reaction. The Lake and Charles case gripped the nation. Headlines emphasized the calculated nature of the crimes. Bunker of horror in California woods, apocalyptic murder plot revealed, and serial killer duo's secret lives. Victims' families were left to cope with trauma and loss, while the public struggled to comprehend how two men could systematically torture, manipulate, and kill without any remorse. Psychologists later studied the case to understand the dynamics of dominance, obedience, and shared sadistic tendencies. So the aftermath and legacy. Even today, the exact number of victims may never be known. The property where they found the bunker has been destroyed, but the evidence remains a stark reminder of what happens when two disturbed individuals reinforce each other's darkest impulses. Project Miranda serves as a grim case study for law enforcement, psychologists, and true crime enthusiasts. A reminder that evil can be very well planned, deliberate, and terrifyingly organized. So by the time Charles was finally in custody and sentenced, the horror of Leonard Lake and Charles' crimes had already left an undeniable mark on the world. Families of the victims were left with grief and unanswered questions. Communities were shaken by the realization that such evil could exist so close to home. But beyond the headlines, beyond the courtroom, the case of Project Miranda remains a window into the darkest corners of human psychology. So now I'm going to go into the psychological aspect of it all, just about Lake and Charles. The question is, what drove Lake and Charles to commit such horrible crimes and murder? Psychologists have studied this case extensively, and there are several key factors that emerge from this study. There's a shared psychopathy. Lake and Charles reinforced each other's delusions, fantasies, and sadistic tendencies. Alone, their crimes may have been less extreme, but together, they became nearly unstoppable. Then there was control and obsession. Lake's desire to dominate, coupled with Charles' willingness to obey and basically escalate violence, create a deadly synergy. And then there was the dehumanization of victims. Both men viewed their victims not as human beings, but as objects, tools, and obstacles. This mindset allowed them to commit unspeakable acts without apparent remorse. Then there was a quote from an expert during the trial that I'm going to go into. He said, "Lake and Charles represent a rare but terrifying instance of mutual reinforcement. Two individuals feeding each other's darkest impulses until morality is completely erased." Just imagine if all serial killers, especially the really bad ones, Ed Gein, Jeffrey Dahmer, John Wayne Gacy, other ones, imagine if they had a partner in crime with them. Their story's bad enough. I can't even imagine if they had someone that was there to help them. More people definitely would have been dead, for sure. And then I'll go into the impact on families and law enforcement. The families of the victims were left to cope with trauma and loss. Many never recovered the remains of their loved ones. Law enforcement, meanwhile, faced the monumental task of cataloging evidence, identifying victims, and piecing together years of meticulous abuse. The case also changed the way investigators approach abduction and serial murder cases. It highlighted the need for rapid response to missing persons, detailed profiling of offenders who work in pairs, and awareness of seemingly isolated rural properties as potential crime scenes. So all in all, the lesson from today's true crime story is this case serves as a cautionary tale for all of us. While most of society will never encounter someone like Charles or Lake, thankfully, Project Miranda reminds us that extreme evil often operates in plain sight. Neighbors, acquaintances, or even people we think we know can harbor dark obsessions. Now, that doesn't mean you shouldn't trust anyone. It's just basically saying watch your back. Because a lot of people hide things they don't want anyone else knowing, and that can get them in trouble and you possibly killed. For those who study true crime, the takeaway is both unsettling and educational. Understanding the psychology of serial killers, particularly those who operate as a duo, is essential to preventing similar tragedies from happening again and again. So, as we close this episode, it's worth remembering the victims, the people whose lives were stolen, whose stories were recorded, and whose suffering teaches us a harsh but necessary lesson about human cruelty. Project Miranda was not only the manifestation of Leonard Lake's fantasies and Charles' compliance, it was a tragedy that continues to echo decades later. And while we may never fully comprehend the minds behind such darkness, we can honor the victims by remembering them, learning from the case, and remaining vigilant against the forces of control, manipulation, and violence that still exists in the world. Thank you for joining me today on The Night Crew. If you found this episode chilling, remember to subscribe to the podcast. Please rate it if you can. Share it with a fellow true crime enthusiast. And leave a comment about what struck you most about this case. Until next time, stay aware, stay safe, and never underestimate the darkness that can hide behind a familiar face.